In France, there's a magazine called Esprit, which is a sort of Christian left magazine. And in the summer of 1968, while the students were demonstrating in the streets and there was a revolt throughout France that was shaking France to its foundations, Esprit called a meeting of its readers, and they invited Foucault. And they asked Foucault a question. Now, before I tell you the question, I'm going to tell you something about how Foucault responded to the question. Foucault said, I think you're asking me whether I'm a reactionary or whether the texts that I've written are intrinsically a sort of coded version of an ultra-conservative doctrine. That's how Foucault responded to the question. Now, here's the question that the readers of Esprit asked Foucault in the summer of 1968. Does not a way of thinking that introduces the constraints of the system, together with discontinuity in the history of mind — I think they're thinking about the order of things, where there's a discontinuity from one episteme to another — does not this, here's the question, take away all grounds for progressive political action? So they're asking Foucault, doesn't your writing take away all grounds for progressive political action? Continue the question. Does it not lead to the dilemma, either accept the system or call for a savage event, an eruption of external violence, which would be the only thing capable of crashing the system? Well, Foucault, I just said, he said, well, I think you're asking me whether I'm a reactionary. And then he says, that question actually does characterize my writings. He recognizes himself in the question almost immediately. I'm going to quote Foucault. You have arrived at a definition of my work that I cannot avoid signing. Close quotes. He goes on, but which leads to consequences no reasonable person would agree with. And then Foucault says, suddenly I feel all my weirdness. It feels weird. The French word is bizarrerie. I feel I'm bizarre. So Foucault writes a long reply to Esprit's question. I guess I didn't quite tell the story right. They invited him, and when they invited him to come speak to them, they sent him a question to speak to. So he writes a long reply, and when he appears, he discusses this reply. He says, and this reply is actually quite similar to Foucault's reply to another group, the Cercle d'Epistémologie de Paris, so the French epistemological circle, at about the same time addressed a similar question to Foucault. And in this reply, he previews some ideas he's going to publish in the Archaeology of Knowledge, which we talked about last time. This is 1968. Archaeology of Knowledge was published in 1969, though he'd already written it in 68. What he says in his reply is, everything is dispersion. Everything is dispersion. There is no system. So they asked him, how do we act progressively to change the system? He says, there is no system. There are only systems, in plural, better described as practices. There is no knowledge in general. There are only knowledges, better described as discursive formations, one of the technical terms in the Archaeology of Knowledge. So now let me mention another point. The same Michel Foucault, 1967, a year earlier, was interviewed in Tunis, in Tunisia, and in that interview he described himself as the choir boy of structuralism, which might make sense if you just read The Order of Things. But apparently he made a rather rapid shift to distancing himself so thoroughly from structuralism in 1968 and 9. Now, Foucault does not answer the hypothetical question that he himself thinks is sort of behind what they're asking, whether he's reactionary. But he answers instead another question he takes to be more legitimate. and to be the question the readers of Esprit are really asking. The question, what is the relationship of his philosophy to political practice? For example, his answer is that his philosophy does lead to progressive political action to change particular practices, which is logical because if particular practices is all there is, then legitimate political action changes particular practices. For example, his research on the history of medicine supports progressive action to curb the abusive power exercised by doctors in modern society. To be counted as a progressive, one need not and one ought not believe any of the totalizing philosophies of history of the 19th century, nor any of their untimely prolongations into the 20th, nor in particular need one follow Louis Althusser in trying to save Marx by separating him from Hegel. So in 1967, in Tunis, Foucault had praised the Althusserian structuralist Marxism as, I quote the interview in Tunis in 1967, an effort to analyze all the conditions of human existence, an effort to understand in its complexity the ensemble of relations that constitute our history, an effort to determine what historical conditions or actions are possible today, quote Foucault, 1967, commenting on Althusser. Now, in the summer of 1968, he endorses dispersion, which is the theme of his book written but not yet published. Well, he says, if that makes me a reactionary, then yes, I'm a reactionary, but distancing myself from structuralist Marxism doesn't make me a reactionary because there are better ways, more particular and more detailed ways, to relate scientific research to social practice and to political action. Well, back to me, I don't think Foucault's answer to the question posed by the readers of Esprit is completely satisfactory. In fact, Foucault himself says, I don't think you're going to find my answer completely satisfactory. When in the question they posed one horn of the dilemma as accept the system, I think they had in mind, we find the system unsatisfactory. It has an inherent tendency to exclude and to generate violence. Indeed, as Christians, we cannot help but notice that it generates each and every one of the 7 deadly sins. We want to contribute to changing the system, but the results of your historical inquiries, Michel Foucault, discourage us, for they seem to say that the course of the history of knowledge, which seems to have some bearing on the course of history in general, is determined by epistemes, impersonal structures nobody can control, which ordinary people do not know about, and which even scholars did not understand until you published your book. So I would paraphrase Foucault's reply to the charge that his philosophy of history discourages those who want to make a difference for good in the world as follows. This is an old French saying, tu me prends pour un autre. You take me for somebody else. You identify me with those old-fashioned philosophers of history who wrote big theories claiming to explain what has happened and to predict what will happen based on what they took to be history's great determining causes. But I'm a modest scholar, devoted to noticing in the sources I study their great variety of discourse and practice. I am averse to embracing great theories, incredulous in the face of those who imagine there's some great system determining events. So far from discouraging your good intentions, I encourage you to take modest political projects to deal with particular discerned evils. So the readers of Esprit are left just about where they were before they got Foucault's answer. They had feared that they were telling him that they could not change the system because it was beyond the power of human mind and will to change it. Now they learn that they can't change the system for a different reason. It's because there is no system. The system is not a legitimate concept. The term does not refer to any entity that a person who has accepted the method and the conclusions of Foucault's studies, as they are about to be published in the Archaeology of Knowledge, would set out to change. So in response to the questions of the readers of Esprit, Foucault develops a vocabulary that defends himself against the charge of regarding history as a single, monolithic, all-powerful, all-pervasive system. But in the course of doing so, he confesses several times he feels his listeners will not be satisfied by his answers. Indeed, they had something in mind when they asked about the system, as Emanuel Wallerstein has something in mind when he writes about the modern world system. neither they nor Wallerstein will be satisfied if Foucault answers in terms that invoke what Lyotard calls incredulity toward meta-narratives. If that means that what they wanted to say when they asked a question about the system cannot be said. So I suggest, now this is me talking again, I suggest that my concept of rules leads to a useful way to interpret the phrase the system in a way that grants meaning to the concerns that the readers of Esprit had in mind. It offers guidance to social activists. So let's interpret the system as meaning this. Let's say what we mean by the system is the basic constitutive rules concerning contracts and property rights, and especially the logic of accumulation and the corresponding need for a regime of accumulation, that is to say, a world where most everything moves when for the sake of profit. Profit is sort of the profit motive is what moves the system. So you can say it's a good system, it's a bad system. I think most of us would say it's a system that has its limitations and defects and therefore needs to be changed, hopefully changed in such a way that we preserve its advantages while correcting its defects and limitations. So I don't agree with Marx or Ricardo, and I don't agree with Foucault, at least the Foucault in the order of things, who agreed with Marx and Ricardo that the level of production is where you really understand what's happening in a capitalist system. I go along with Maynard Keynes, Karl Polanyi, others who attribute to markets what Marx called the sphere of circulation a really important role. So the system, well, okay, you can say an important aspect of the system is who owns the means of production, but some of us want to say an even more important aspect of the system is that we're in a buying and selling game. The game of life has become to a great extent a game of buying and selling. So we can talk to some considerable extent about a very pervasive material practice. We don't have to be totalizing. We don't have to say everything is explained by the fact that humans live by buying and selling, but we can say, along with Pierre Bourdieu, for example, there's no single great system that determines everything, but there is one particular practice, namely buying and selling for the sake of profit, that determines a great deal, and we're not going to understand much about the modern world if we don't understand that. So to say with the readers of Esprit that we don't want to accept the system, that we want to change it, can be interpreted in the spirit of John Dewey as being a thoroughgoing pragmatist, consistent pragmatist who wants to move whatever parameters need to move in order to solve complete problems. The readers of Esprit quite wisely regarded a savage event destroying the system as not as one horn of a dilemma. We don't want either a great crash and revolutionary violence followed by more violence. We don't want that. We also don't want to just accept the system as it is. And I want to suggest that the rules, critical realist, John Dewey type approach, does make it possible to talk about the system and think reasonably about how to change it. So the readers of Esprit want to know, I think, two more things about the system. One is, why is it so hard to change it? People have been trying to change it for centuries and somehow it stubbornly persists. And secondly, how to change it? What do we do to change it? I think here too that this rules talk helps. The basic constitutive rules of modern society, here I'm using the idea of constitutive rules developed by Charles Taylor and by John Searle with roots in Wittgenstein, and I'm adding the idea of basic. In other words, what makes a constitutive rule basic is it has to do with satisfying the basic necessities of life, like getting food and like being safe on the street so you're not killed. So these basic rules, we want to say, the constitutive rules in a sense of Taylor and Searle, the ones that define markets and production for sale, they make inevitable what a Marxist scholar like Ellen Wood calls systemic imperatives. So these systemic imperatives can be seen as consequences of the constitutive rule. Well, what is a systemic imperative? Ellen Wood, in her very good books, gives a number of examples of systemic imperatives. One of them would be you have to cut costs. If you're in business, you have to keep your costs down, right? And that's just the way the system works. The rules of the game are such that if you pay your workers everything they're asking for, you very likely won't be able to sell your product for a high enough price to cover your costs of production, and you'll go out of business. So this is a systemic imperative. The system just works that way. In the language of the French regulationist school, people like Robert Boyer, the system is hard to change because it requires some kind of regime of accumulation. This is also sort of the moral of Bourdieu and Passeron's book about education. Education can't change the system. Education has to serve the system, because whatever else happens in the system, you have to have a regime of accumulation, which means that education, culture, politics, even Frederick Jameson would even say the subconscious mind, everything has to be geared to the one thing necessary, which is to keep up the confidence of investors that they're going to make profits, because if they don't invest in advance operating capital, nothing will move in the system as it is. So to the extent that there is this is in place, some of the sort of obvious ways to change the system don't work. Say, we're going to be a strong labor union, we're going to demand higher wages, or we're going to have a political movement, and we're going to change the tax system, so we're going to tax the rich and not tax the poor. We have all these ideas that obviously seem fair and just, at least at the level of common sense, but in fact they don't work because they violate the systemic imperative of the system. So I think we can think about that, and we can think about how to change it with the sort of realist approach I'm proposing. So among the reasons why the system is hard to change, another one is that what you might call a crisis of authority, a lack of adequate cultures of authority and social responsibility. People don't pay their taxes. They ignore environmental regulations. They prefer stealing to working. They don't volunteer for community service. They don't have a sense of stewardship and responsibility as we wish they would. So this common failure can be expressed in terms of rules talk by saying this: it doesn't matter what the rules are if people don't follow them. So we can sort of think in two terms. We can say, well, here we have what you might call a problem of upbringing and moral education, which is to make it possible to have populations of human beings who behave better, or better, more conscientious human beings. That's sort of part of the problem. I have a very important opinion about that. I think it's very important, following Erik Erikson, that if we're going to get a sort of pro-social population of people who sort of want to be good and want to help others, we've got to start with newborns. Newborns have got to have basic trust. If they don't, it's psychologically very hard to establish a pro-social personality in later life. Well, that's kind of one set of problems, that is, people don't follow the rules. The other problem is the rules are dysfunctional. Even if you do follow the rules, following the rules, and that's, I think, a great lesson from Karl Marx. Karl Marx says, many of Karl Marx followers seem to spend most of their time complaining about capitalists who cheat. But Marx's point is not about capitalists who cheat, it's about when they don't cheat. It's what happens when you simply follow the rules of the game, according to his analysis, which he admits is a simplified analysis. You get an accumulation of wealth at one end and an accumulation of poverty at the other. So this is a practical and pertinent answer. It's pertinent particularly in Paris in 1968. It suggests that rather too much time and energy is spent in protest demonstrations of the sorts that were going on in Paris, and that you could do more. It would be more effective to organize alternative practices organized according to different rules. That is, the problem is not so much to bring down the system as it is to produce something better, or a series of improvements that will actually work better. Now, protests usually require an existing rule. That's why you protest, because somebody's in jail who ought to be released, or because the police fired on the crowd and killed a lot of people, which violates a basic norm of respect for human life. But social change requires organizing institutions that do not exist yet, but which will function according to better rules, in the sense that the people who follow them will have better lives, and we will save the biosphere from destruction because we will make the necessary transition to a green society, and so on. Okay, so see what I'm saying? I'm saying that we need authority, but we also need to change authority. We need to have a different authority which prescribes acting in ways that are sustainable and desirable for the human species. Okay, so I've been suggesting that rules talk is rooted in common sense, and there are systemic reasons why in the 20th century, and beginning with Nietzsche and others in the 19th century, there have been heavy attempts toward attacks on common sense, okay? So what I'm saying, look, you sort of act like late Wittgenstein. You sort of observe daily life as it is and the role of language in it, and then you get into Charles Taylor and these guys. And these guys are really, well, the rules of daily life, Taylor tells us, are the rules of a bargaining society. This bargaining society has very important defects which we need to correct. So given the consequence that looking at the everyday rules of common sense in everyday life is going to lead you to criticize the system and want to change it, people who don't want to change the system are very likely to devote themselves to attacking common sense. And there have been a whole series of attacks on common sense, of which perhaps Nietzsche in the 19th century was the great forerunner. Common sense can only lead to the kind of critique that Marx did, not exactly to Marx, and not Marx in the sense of pretext for violence or blah, 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 but Marx in the sense that we'll keep Marx on the agenda for a long time, is his critique of property and markets. And as long as we have these institutions, he'll be somebody who has to be read to sort of help us to think about them. And as long as that happens, I think we're going to have people who would rather try to make some philosophical move that will just get us out of this whole conversation. So, having replied, back to Foucault, having replied to the readers of Esprit that he himself doubted they would be happy with, and having explained archaeology, Foucault also, at about the same time, became uneasy with the relationship of his approach to history to the concepts of cause and effect. Now, about the same time, actually about some months later, after he gave this talk to the people at Esprit magazine, and a similar talk at the Epistemological Circle, he wrote a research proposal for the Collège de France. And in the research proposal, he announces he wants to take up again the question of causality, cause and effect. That, in a way, that's what embarrassed him when he went to talk to the people at Esprit, why he said he sort of felt his weirdness, because he felt he had a kind of a weird philosophy because it didn't really say much or anything about cause and effect. It deliberately didn't, as we've discussed before. It's about sort of stationary cultural codes, or at least it was in '66. So, high time. It's about time that Foucault decided, as he did in '69, I'm going to look at the question of causality, cause and effect. Dreyfus and Rabineau, some great Foucault scholars, say that Foucault had to become very close to falling into what they call the illusion of autonomous discourse, as if discourse language were somehow autonomous from everything else and had its own rules quite independently of material reality. So Foucault himself says, I feel a little weird having been called on this point. So unless the world is very different from what Kant thought it was, remember Kant thought that the world had to be governed by causality. There had to be regular laws because the human mind can't understand it. We can't possibly have an experience that's not subject to some notion of cause and effect. So if there's any truth at all in scientific reasoning that thinks there are cause and effects, and Kantian philosophy that thinks we necessarily think that way, then these stories that Foucault was telling us about history cannot possibly be history as it really happened. So in the Birth of the Clinic, back in 1961, Foucault came close to saying that political and economic events that were not just discourse produced changes in the discourse of medicine. Medical doctors started talking about signs and symptoms in the clinic and the diagnosis as a result of sort of material historical events that seem very, very close to being a sort of realistic explanation of the origins of modern medicine. Non-talk caused talk. But he backed away from this drift into materialism when he wrote Raymond Roussel, when he wrote Les mots et les choses, and when he wrote The Archaeology of Knowledge. Les mots et les choses is the same thing as The Order of Things. Nonetheless, he always denied that he simply wanted to erase and deny the category of causality. What he usually said he was doing was that he was not determining which causes produce which effects. He was doing something else, and the something he was doing, the archaeology, was more fundamental, but in some way that he never explained, not unrelated to cause and effects. Well, in late 1969, he decided to take another look. He says, now he submits a research proposal. I'm going to take another look at the category of causality and how it relates to the order of knowledge. Now, for good old Kant, the relationship of concepts to causes was reasonably clear. You know, we all think it's wrong nowadays, or most of us think it's wrong, but it was wrong but clear. There were two realms. There was the a priori realm, which did not depend on experience, and there was the a posteriori realm, which did depend on experience. The concept of cause was given a priori. It was part of what we know before we study anything whatever. We already know that there's such a thing as cause and effects, and anything whatever must be some field of possible scientific study in which, if we study hard enough, we will find the causes and the effects. But the realm of experience, or of phenomena, which sometimes Kant called intuitions or percepts, was necessarily a world governed by causal laws. Kant says concepts without percepts are empty, because this a priori form tells us, well, there's got to be some cause and effect, but what? It doesn't tell us what, or it doesn't tell us anything concrete. But percepts without concepts, in other words, experience without a conceptual apparatus, is blind, because you can't make any sense of experience without ordering it in categories. And you have to have categories like space, time, cause and effect to make sense of experience. So nearly 200 years later, Foucault in 1969 tells the Collège de France, now I'm going to study causality. But 200 years later, this sort of clarity that Kant had was muddled, and Foucault himself had been a muddler who had muddled it, because this eternal and universal a priori had been replaced, and Foucault replaced it with an historical a priori. You know, before we can diagnose somebody as sane or insane, we have to have a concept of insanity. But we can't have a concept of insanity without a historical development of a culture which produces a concept of insanity. So the a priori of Kant, which had simply been a characteristic of the human mind everywhere at all times, becomes for Foucault a characteristic of a certain culture at a certain point in history, which is able to make it possible to think in certain concepts, such as madness, for example. So the conditions of the possibility of experience, we're quoting Kant there, continue to play a role, but they play a different role. They change from one century to another. They had left the eternal realm of Kant's a priori that does not depend on experience and had joined the hurly-burly of time, but they hadn't made it all the way. There was still some confusion about what's the relationship between what is historically possible to say and what it is that people are actually saying and doing. So these are the sort of questions that I think Foucault needed to ask himself and did ask himself when he wrote his research proposal. One is, what causes the changes in the concepts that determine what experiences are possible? As we know from Foucault, that in the 17th century you could not diagnose somebody as insane because, number one, the concept of insanity didn't exist, and number two, the concept of diagnosis didn't exist. So there had to be a change in culture to make that sort of everyday practice today in mental hospitals possible. So this question is difficult to separate from the questions about what it is that moves history in general. Or maybe nothing moves history in general. Maybe just a series of diverse causes. Or however history might be moved, how are scholars going to determine the cause of movement? I think that's one kind of question that Foucault decided he would address. Remember at the beginning of the order of knowledge, at the beginning of the archaeology of knowledge, he criticized people for trying to determine the causes of history. But now he's going to have a go at it himself. He's going to try to explain what are causes in history. Now, secondly, a second different question is, how do cultures of different times understand cause and effect? Now, here, a realist might say, or like the economic historians, they could say, look, you could say, well, today's scientific notions of how you think about cause and effect are pretty good. We have a pretty good idea about demographic processes. We know about climate change and other ecological causes. We know how markets work. We know something about how myths organize cultures. And with all these things that we know, we can go back and study other cultures at other times and places with the benefit of sort of existing notions of cause and effect in our scientific apparatus. Now, a little bit like when you send spaceships out into outer space, you find out that in distant planets, and even not by spaceships but by other means of research, you find out that in very distant galaxies you have the same chemistry we have on Earth. Now we know about hydrogen, we know about helium, we know about sound waves and the characteristics of sound waves. So all these things we discovered on Earth, well, we can take out into outer space and we find these same conceptual patterns work there too. We could have said that, but he didn't. He could have, in other words, he could have decided to become a realist who says, well, there's something about science that tells us that there must be a world out there that has some characteristic like what they're discovering, because that's otherwise what science is doing would be incredible. He could have done that, but he didn't. He didn't want to go there. He remained reluctant to continue in the direction he was going in the birth of the clinic toward realist historical explanations. But at this point, he's now been backed into a corner where he realizes he can't simply disregard causality. He's got to say something about it. He can't pretend to know nothing about it on the pretext that we know nothing certain, or that different cultures, different points in history think about it different ways. So So there you have it. 1968, Foucault, speaking to Esprit magazine, is embarrassed that he seems to be a reactionary because in the last analysis he has no concept of cause and effect. He can't advise us on how to change the system because he can't say anything about what makes the system work or how to change it, because he has limited his investigations to what he calls an archaeological realm, which is supposed to be a different realm, doesn't deal with that. Therefore, he seemed to be a conservative or even a reactionary. He had to accept things as they are because his philosophy allowed no concept of social activism oriented by causes that can be rationally expected to produce effects. On the other hand, the club of scientific realists who do have a concept of cause and effect, that's a club Foucault doesn't want to join. So in 1969, he submits a research proposal saying, now I'm going to devote myself to studying the causality and its relationship to the order of knowledge. So what's Foucault going to do now? Where will his study of cause and effect lead him? How can he come up with a convincing concept of cause and effect that would not lead him back to the economic history that he doesn't want? So how could he think about causes without falling into the camp of the scientific realists where he doesn't want to be? So in the next lecture, what I want to suggest is that he found in the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche the answers that he was looking for.